guys, it's Alice, and today I thought I would recommend some classics to read if you, like me, are a non-native English speaker. So as I'm sure most of you know, I'm Norwegian and English is my second language, and I thought I would do this video because I get quite a lot of questions about what classic to read if you're not from an English-speaking country but you want to try and read a classic in English. Now, in Norway, I'd say we're generally pretty good at English, probably because we're just exposed to it so much, and we do start English pretty early in school. I tried Googling what grade exactly you start in, but I couldn't really find it. I think when I was at school, we started getting really into it in like the 4th grade. A lot of what's on TV here is also in English with subtitles. Like, it's very rare that anything is dubbed unless it's for children. And I remember when I was a kid, I found that really helpful. Like, I felt like I learned a lot from it. I've also been very fortunate with my English teachers. Like, I remember my English teacher in primary school. I loved her. She was really strict, but I loved her classes. I also absolutely loved my high school English teacher, and I remember those classes made me want to read more classics, and it was in high school when I started to read more and more books in English, and by my early 20s I read almost only in English. Not just classics obviously, but just like English books in general. I don't really know why I'm saying this, but I will say I don't think going straight from reading only in your native language to reading a really heavy classic is the way to go. Like, I think it's a lot easier if you start with something that is a little easier to read. Like, maybe you want to reread a book you've already read because it's obviously a lot easier to read when you know what's going on, and you won't have to like stop all the time. The first book I read in English was the last Harry Potter book, which wasn't a reread, but I obviously knew all the characters and I knew the world and everything, so it wasn't that difficult to understand. And also, it is a children's book, so the language is quite simple. Now, for me, the more I read in English, the easier classics become to read as well, and at this point, there isn't really a classic that scares me because of the language. I will say though, I do struggle with some of them, and especially like the older the book is, the more I struggle. I don't know if it's that way for everyone, but that's the way it is for me. I also struggle with like Jane Austen. Even though I love Jane Austen, I sometimes find the language a little bit difficult to get on with, although I have included a Jane Austen on this list. Just in case you want to read it, I will tell you how to cheat, because that's what I did the first time I read it. So anyways, I've picked out a bunch of classics that I feel like are relatively easy to read, and I've sort of tried to sort them so that they go from a little easier to read to a little bit harder. That was a little bit more difficult than I thought it was going to be, but I've tried to put them in some sort of order. First up, we've got one of my favorite books, and I'm sure people who have been around for a while saw this coming, and it is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is the story of a young girl who goes to live with her uncle in England and discovers this secret garden. I read this for the first time when I was quite young, and at that point I obviously read it in Norwegian, but I reread it in English in my early teens, and I didn't find it difficult at all. It is a children's book, so obviously the language can't be too challenging. Secondly, we have got The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. This is a young adult book, and it's a short story collection, but all of the stories in here are sort of linked, and they're about this young Latina girl growing up in Chicago. This is pretty short, so it's not too intimidating, and it is simply written, but it's also really beautiful. Next, I've got a book that I read when I was about 16 or 17 because we read it for English class, and it is The Lord of the Flies by William Golding. This follows a group of young boys who are stranded on an island after their plane crashes there, and this is a book I feel like a lot of people read for class. I didn't really appreciate it that much the first time I read it because there is something really annoying about having to read a book for class and then like sit down and analyze it, but I have read it since and I really like it. The first time I did read this though, I really didn't struggle with the language at all, and it is one of the first books that I read in English, so I feel like it's pretty easy to read. Then we've got a book where the language is quite easy, I feel, but some of the stuff that happens in it can be a little bit confusing, and it is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Now, if I got a penny for every time someone goes, "Oh my god, it's just like Alice in Wonderland," whenever I introduce myself, I would have a lot of pennies, but that's besides the point. This is of course a children's book, and the story is about Alice who tumbles down a rabbit hole and ends up in Wonderland. I do think what's going on in the book can be a little bit confusing if you're not familiar with the story, but I'd say it's not too bad, and the language is really very simple. Then we have got To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. This is set in a small southern town in the 1930s, and we see what happens to this town when this black man is accused of raping a white woman, and we see all of it through the eyes of a young girl. Now, I read this quite recently, so I was like wondering if it actually was as easy to read as I think it is, but I actually found it on a lot of like easy to read classics list, so I feel pretty safe saying it is easy to read. Next, we're moving into the territory of a little bit more difficult to read, but not a lot really. And first up here, we have got The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is the story of Jay Gatsby and the love of his life, Daisy, and it's quite a short book, and I didn't really struggle with it at all the first time I read it, even though I wasn't familiar with the story. I do think the language is a little more philosophical maybe, which can be a little bit more challenging, but I do think it is very easy to read. I don't know if I feel like this is a lot more difficult to read than To Kill a Mockingbird. I also just have to include an Agatha Christie because I love her, and the one that I've chosen is And Then There Were None. Agatha Christie is one of the authors that I started with when I started reading in English, so I feel like she can be a good place to start. This one is a standalone, and it's about 10 strangers who meet on this island and suddenly everyone starts dying. I also think Poirot or Miss Marple can be a good place to start if you want to read those instead. We've also got a book that I don't actually have a copy of because it's just gone and it's been gone forever now, and it is Animal Farm by George Orwell. This is about a bunch of farm animals who take over their farm, and we see the society that sort of springs from that rebellion, which sounds odd, but it is a commentary on tyranny and totalitarianism. And I've never found Orwell difficult to read, but I did start reading his works in like my early 20s when I already read quite a lot in English. Another dystopian novel you can read if you want to is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I think this is a little bit more of a challenging read, not necessarily because of the language, but because of what goes on in it. It's set in a world that's quite different from ours, and people are like genetically modified and stuff like that. This is one of those books that I struggle to sort of place on the scale of how difficult it is to read, but I feel like maybe this doesn't need to be your first classic in English. It is a little bit of an effort, I feel, but it's worth it. Then we have got Someone at a Distance by Dorothy Whipple. This is the story of what happens to a family when the father of the family runs off with this French woman. And I love Dorothy Whipple's books. I think they're really charming, and I have never struggled with any of them. I feel like you can kind of choose whichever one you like and you'll be fine. Next, I've got a book that I wondered if I should put on here, and I wonder where on the scale of how difficult it is to read it really should be, so I'm just putting it here because it's easy to read, but it's also written quite differently. But then I read it in my teens and I was fine. And it is Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. This is a science fiction novel about this mentally disabled man who takes a part in this experiment where his IQ starts increasing drastically. And the book is written through his diary entries. And the reason I think it can be a little bit challenging is that in the beginning, the writing is like filled with spelling errors, and it can be a little bit difficult to understand because of that. And then it moves on to being written by this incredibly intelligent man, so it gets kind of complicated and philosophical. But then again, I read it when I was quite young and I didn't struggle with it at all, so I feel like it's probably fine. The last three books I've got are kind of older classics and maybe the type of classic that you think about when people say classics. Because they are older though, they are a little bit more difficult to read, I think, but I think it can be done because I managed to do it. And the first one is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I'd say out of all the sort of older classics that I've read, this is by far the easiest. Like, I remember the first time I read it, I was so surprised by how easy it was to get into. The story is about Jane, who we follow from the time where she grows up at an orphanage to eventually moving to Thornfield Hall and meeting Mr. Rochester. If you really feel like just jumping straight into one of the Brontes, this is the one to go with. Second to last, we have got Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. I do think this is a little bit more challenging, but I think it can be done without too much effort. The story is about this really independent woman who moves to the country to take up a position at the biggest farm and estate in the area, and she meets 3 men who complicate her life. Like I said, a little bit more challenging, but it can be done. I think if you just take your time with this, you'll really like it. Lastly, as promised, we have got a Jane Austen novel, and the reason I've chosen this one is because when I started reading classics, I jumped straight into this one and I was so confused, but I did make my way through it, and it is Pride and Prejudice. When I first started reading this, I really hadn't read a lot of books in English, let alone classics, and I really struggled with it. Like, I literally didn't know what was going on. I barely realized who the characters were. Like, I was so confused and I really struggled with the language. So after reading about 50 pages, I gave up. But then a couple of months later, I watched the movie, the 2006 adaptation of it, and that really helped me. So I went back to this and started reading it again, and because I had sort of met the characters in the book and I knew who they were and I sort of knew where the story was going, it made me capable of enjoying it, because if I lost my way, which I did a lot, I could use the movie to remind myself where we were. Since then, I have read this again, and it was a lot easier the second time I read it. But just, if you, for some reason, you just have to read a Jane Austen, do whatever you can to just make it easier for yourself if you're struggling. Also, if you don't want to start with a full novel, you can read short stories instead. Like, I actually feel like that's a great place to start. You can find some sort of genre or theme that you like and see if there's a classical short story collection that goes along with that. Like, I know Everyman's Library published loads of them, and then you get to try loads of different authors, and if you come across a short story that you don't like, you can just skip it. Now, before we go, I just want to mention something that I feel like is so stupid to mention, but I also feel like I have to. You don't need to read classics. Like, if you're not into it, you don't have to do it. I know a lot of people feel pressure around the types of books that they should read or should have read, but honestly, it's not that big of a deal. If you're not into it, just don't do it. Oh, and by the way, if you are reading a classic that you're struggling with, what I do when that happens to me is that I use the internet for all that it's worth. Like, I'll use something like SparkNotes. I love SparkNotes. To like check up on characters if I forget them, or I'll read the chapter summaries after I've read the chapter just to make sure I got it all. I do this for books I don't really struggle with too. Like, when I read War and Peace, I did it just to like make sure that I knew what was going on. And then Anna Karenina, I didn't really struggle with at all, and I read this year, but I just read the chapter summaries just to see that I got it all. Okay guys, that was everything I had to talk about today. I hope some of you will find this helpful, and I would also love to know if any of you have any recommendations for classics you think are easy to read, and also, what is your experience with reading classics in general? Do you like it? Do you not care? Or what? And I'll see you soon. Bye!